The stones remember. From Canaan to empire, from temple to mosque, from Ottoman twilight to Western rupture, a history of Jerusalem and the long contest for sacred land. By Elias Winter, April 4th, 2026. Read by an automated voice. 1. Before Israel, there was Canaan. Before the city became an argument, before it became a promise, before it became a wound recited in prayer and blood, there was Canaan. The land that would later be called holy by Jews, Christians, and Muslims was not born holy in the abstract. It was a corridor. It was a bridge between Egypt and Mesopotamia, between empires that could never leave the Levant alone, because geography would not let them. Armies crossed it. Traders crossed it. Gods crossed it. Languages crossed it. The land did not belong to one people in the modern sense, because the modern sense did not yet exist. It was held in fragments, in city-states, in fortified hills and agricultural plains, in local cults and regional loyalties. The people who lived there were what historians call Canaanites, a family of related Semitic-speaking populations spread across the Levant, sharing broad cultural patterns, religious ideas, and material life. Their world was not a nation, but a mosaic. Cities such as Hazor, Megiddo, and Lachish rose and fell under local rulers, while larger powers pressed down from afar. In one era, Egypt was the distant master, ruling Canaan through local kings, tribute, diplomacy, and occasional force. The Amarna letters preserve the sound of that order. Anxious Canaanite rulers writing to Pharaoh, pleading for help, reporting rebellion, negotiating survival in a world where sovereignty was always thin. This matters because later histories often begin with Israel as though nothing meaningful existed before it. But there was already a civilization here, already memory, already fields and walls and shrines. The Jewish story begins in a land that was not empty, not waiting, not inert. It begins inside an older human world. 2. A people emerges from inside the land. When the Israelites appear in history, they do not enter like a clean blade from outside. They emerge out of the same Semitic world that preceded them. The biblical narrative tells the story one way. Abraham leaves Mesopotamia, his descendants go down to Egypt, Moses leads them out, Joshua conquers Canaan, and a covenant people takes possession of a promised land. This narrative would shape Jewish self-understanding for millennia and remains central to religious memory. But secular history, archaeology, and the study of material continuity suggest a more complicated emergence. Around the end of the Late Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age, roughly around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean underwent collapse. Empires weakened. Trade networks fragmented. Old cities declined. In the highlands of Canaan, new settlements appeared. Small agrarian villages, modest, locally rooted, not obviously the footprint of a vast incoming army. The pottery, architecture, and everyday life of these communities looked deeply continuous with the Canaanite environment from which they arose. Their language, too, would be a Canaanite language. Hebrew, close kin to Phoenician, and related dialects of the region. This does not prove that every ancestral memory in the Bible is false, nor does it dissolve the power of the Abrahamic story. It does something more unsettling and more historically plausible. It suggests that the Israelites were, to a large extent, a people formed from within Canaan itself. Not pure outsiders, not the opposite of Canaanites, a branch that differentiated itself, a social and religious reconfiguration within an older Levantine landscape. The first historical mention of Israel appears not in Hebrew scripture, but in the Merneptah stele, an Egyptian inscription from around 1208 BCE. Israel is already there, in the land, named as a people. Not yet a kingdom, not yet a state, but already a presence. So the beginning is not a simple arrival. It is an emergence. A people becomes itself by distinguishing itself from the world that produced it. 3. Jerusalem becomes a center. At first, the Israelites are not united under one stable monarchy. They exist as tribes, local coalitions, loose alliances, a confederated people held together by memory, kinship, and crisis. Their early political form is unstable because their world is unstable. But then comes centralization. Then comes kingship. Then comes Jerusalem. Tradition places Saul first, then David, then Solomon, in a line that marks the transition from tribal federation to kingdom. However one judges the scale of the so-called united monarchy, the symbolic transformation is decisive. David captures Jerusalem and makes it a capital. Solomon builds the first temple. A hill city becomes the political and religious axis of a people. This is one of the great acts of civilizational concentration in the ancient Near East. Power, worship, dynastic legitimacy, and sacred geography converge in one place. Jerusalem is no longer merely a city among others. It becomes center, nerve, symbol. The temple becomes the house of the God of Israel. The monarchy anchors itself in Davidic memory. The city becomes the meeting point of heaven, people, and rule. Whether the kingdom was as vast as later biblical texts suggest is a matter of debate. Archaeology has not confirmed a grand empire on the scale of the most maximal biblical reading, but the historical question of scale should not obscure the deeper fact. Jerusalem became central. Once that happened, everything changed. The city entered the grammar of permanence. It would never again be only a city. 4. The kingdom splits. The empires gather. After Solomon, the kingdom fractures. The unified monarchy gives way to two political entities. The northern kingdom of Israel, with Samaria as its capital, and the southern kingdom of Judah, centered on Jerusalem. This split weakens both. Israel in the north is larger, richer, more exposed. Judah in the south is smaller, poorer, more defensible, more tightly bound to the temple and the Davidic line. The split is not just political, it is structural. Two Hebrew-speaking kingdoms now face the same geopolitical reality separately, and that reality is merciless. The Levant is a narrow strip between massive powers. A small kingdom there is never simply itself. It is always a frontier, always a buffer, always at risk of becoming a battlefield for stronger states. Egypt watches from the southwest. Mesopotamian empires rise from the northeast. The internal split of the Israelite world makes imperial absorption not inevitable, but increasingly likely. Small states can survive between empires if they remain unimportant, invisible, or unusually skilled. But when trade routes, tribute, military access, or symbolic power are involved, invisibility becomes impossible. The two Hebrew kingdoms continue, but the empires are gathering. 5. Assyria. Terror as statecraft. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was one of the most formidable and brutal imperial machines of the ancient world. It did not merely conquer, it made conquest into theater. Its kings boasted of flaying rebels, impaling enemies, and deporting entire populations. Assyrian cruelty was not an accidental excess, but a system. Terror was policy. In 722 BCE, Assyria destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. Samaria fell. Elites and populations were deported. Foreign groups were resettled. The northern kingdom ceased to exist as a sovereign state. In later Jewish memory, this becomes the tragedy of the lost tribes, but at the level of political history, it was something stark and anciently familiar. A small kingdom had been consumed by empire. This is the first great rupture of Israelite sovereignty. It is also a lesson in ancient statehood. To stand in the path of Assyria without Assyrian scale, Assyrian bureaucracy, or Assyrian military force was to stand on borrowed time. Israel did not lose because its story was false. It lost because the world of iron empires had no sentiment for covenant. And yet even here, the destruction is not only military, it is narrative. Assyria teaches the region a lesson every empire loves to teach, that it is not enough to rule land. One must also teach others that resistance is futile. The northern kingdom disappears not only from maps, but from political continuity. 6. Babylon and the burning of the first temple. Judah survived Assyria, but surviving one empire in the Levant rarely means escaping empire altogether. The Assyrians fell, and Babylon rose. In 586 BCE, the Neo-Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II destroyed Jerusalem, ended the Davidic monarchy, and burned the first temple. This is one of the definitive catastrophes in Jewish history. The northern kingdom had already been lost. Now the southern kingdom, the temple city, the dynastic heart, fell as well. The temple's destruction was not simply architectural devastation. It shattered the concentration created under David and Solomon. A people whose God had been worshipped in a specific house in a specific city now faced a terrible question. What becomes of covenant when the house is ash and the city is breached? What becomes of identity when sovereignty is gone? Babylon deported elites to Mesopotamia. This was a known imperial technique. Remove leadership, break resistance, integrate the defeated into a larger order. Exile begins here not merely as movement, but as a civilizational problem. The people are no longer fully where their story says they should be. If Assyria ended the northern kingdom, Babylon ended the original Jerusalem-centered sovereignty of Judah. This is the deeper rupture. It is why 586 BCE matters so profoundly. The temple is gone, the king is gone, the city is broken, the people remain. 7. Persia and the mercy of empire. Then Persia appears, not as tribal rumor, but as world historical force. The Persians had once been one Iranian people among others on the plateau, part of a larger Indo-Iranian world, long before they became empire. By the 6th century BCE, under Cyrus the Great, they transformed themselves into the Achaemenid Empire, one of the largest political systems the world had yet seen. In 539 BCE, Cyrus conquered Babylon. For the Jews in exile, this was not merely a change of rulers, it was the beginning of restoration. Cyrus permitted exiled populations, including the Jews, to return and rebuild. This was not altruism in the modern moral sense. Persia governed differently from Assyria and Babylon. It often preferred local restoration under imperial supervision to total homogenization. But to the Jews, Persian rule could be experienced as mercy because empire had shifted from destruction to permission. The Second Temple was completed in 516 BCE under Persian rule. That formulation matters. The Persians did not themselves become Jews or build the temple as their own sacred project. They allowed, endorsed, and administratively supported Jewish rebuilding. Jerusalem regained a sanctuary, but not sovereignty. Judah, now Yahud, existed as a Persian province. This distinction is central to the whole history that follows. Persia restored religious life, not independent statehood. Jewish continuity revived within empire, not outside it. The temple returned, but empire remained. 8. The Greeks arrive, and Jerusalem learns to speak in two tongues. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great shattered Persian power in the Levant. Jerusalem passed from Achaemenid rule into the Hellenistic world. If Persia had ruled by imperial permission and provincial restoration, the Greeks brought something else, a vast cultural pressure field. After Alexander's death, his empire fractured. Jerusalem fell first under the Ptolemies of Egypt, and later under the Seleucids of Syria. Greek rule over Jerusalem lasted roughly from 332 BCE to the rise of the Hasmoneans around 140 BCE, nearly 2 centuries in all. Much of this period was administratively stable. Jewish life continued. The temple stood. But the city was now within a world that spoke another language of prestige. Hellenism was not just foreign rule. It was seduction. It offered philosophy, urban refinement, civic institutions, a broader intellectual world, and a cosmopolitan mode of self-understanding. Jerusalem did not simply resist it. It learned to negotiate it. The city began to speak in two tongues, its own covenantal memory and the vocabulary of the wider Greek world. That double consciousness would define the period. Some adapted, some collaborated, some resisted. It is easy to narrate Hellenism as pure oppression because of how the story ends in revolt. But for long stretches, it was a condition of cultural mixture, tension, aspiration, and ambiguity. Jerusalem was not yet broken by it. It was being asked to become more than one thing at once. 9. The Revolt of the Maccabees. The crisis comes under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid ruler whose policies toward Jewish practice, temple life, and Hellenization ignited revolt. Here memory hardens into an event that would be carried for centuries. Desecration, resistance, purification, return. The Maccabean revolt, beginning in 167 BCE, was not merely an uprising against foreign taxation or administrative pressure. It was experienced as an assault on covenantal life itself. Mattathias and his sons, especially Judas Maccabeus, became the faces of rebellion. The temple was rededicated. Hanukkah enters the structure of Jewish time. But the revolt was more than piety with swords. It opened the way to Jewish sovereignty again. The Hasmonean dynasty emerged from this struggle and eventually established an independent Jewish kingdom, roughly from 140 BCE to 63 BCE. This was the first true restoration of Jewish political independence since the Babylonian destruction. And yet restoration carried its own contradictions. The Hasmoneans fused priestly and royal authority. They expanded territorially beyond Old Judah. They ruled, fought, and governed as a regional state. Jewish sovereignty had returned, but not in the old Davidic form. Independence came back through revolt and dynasty, not by resurrecting the original kingdom exactly as it had been. 10. Rome takes what the Hasmoneans could not hold. The Hasmonean achievement was real. It was also unstable. Internal factionalism, dynastic struggle, disputes over legitimacy, and the tension between priesthood and kingship weakened the state from within. The ancient pattern returned. A local polity in the Levant becomes vulnerable not only because empires are strong, but because internal division invites intervention. In 63 BCE, Pompey entered Jerusalem. Rome took control. Jewish sovereignty ended again. Rome's genius was different from that of Assyria. It could be brutal beyond measure, but it also understood client kingship, administrative layering, indirect control, and the harnessing of local elites. Under Rome, Herod the Great rebuilt and massively expanded the Second Temple precinct, even as he ruled as a client king under imperial authority. This was one of the great ironies of the age. The temple reached monumental splendor under a ruler dependent on a foreign empire. Judea under Rome became what so many small lands become under world systems: strategically important, spiritually charged, politically managed, inwardly tense. Rome had taken what the Hasmoneans could not hold, but it had not solved the contradiction of Jerusalem. It had only imperialized it. 11. Jesus in the shadow of the Second Temple. Jesus of Nazareth appears in this world, not after the temple, but under its looming presence. He lives and dies while the Second Temple still stands. The city is under Roman domination, but the temple remains the institutional and symbolic center of Jewish life. Sacrifices are still made. Priests still serve. Pilgrims still come. This matters because later Christian consciousness can obscure it. Jesus does not arise in a post-temple void. He arises within Second Temple Judaism under Roman occupation, amid apocalyptic expectation, sectarian dispute, messianic tension, and imperial pressure. His life unfolds in a Jerusalem that is still old in form, even as its foundations are already shaking. His followers are Jews. The categories have not yet fully split. Early Christianity begins not as a separate civilization, but as a movement within the Jewish world of the first century. And yet history is preparing a profound divergence. The temple still stands during Jesus' lifetime, but the age in which it can remain central is nearing its end. In this sense, Christianity is born in the shadow of the temple, and the empire simultaneously. It carries the memory of both. 12. 70. C.E. The fire that changed Judaism. In 70, C.E. Rome destroyed the Second Temple during the suppression of the Great Jewish Revolt. Jerusalem burned. The temple, rebuilt under Persian permission and expanded under Roman client kingship, was gone. This was not the beginning of Jewish suffering, nor the first loss of sovereignty, but it was a civilizational rupture of exceptional force. If 586 BCE had shattered the First Temple world, 70 CE shattered the restored Temple world. The center of sacrifice, pilgrimage, and priestly service vanished. Here one must be precise. Jewish political sovereignty had not existed in an unbroken way since the Hasmoneans and had already been subordinated to Rome. The catastrophe of 70 CE was not that sovereignty suddenly vanished from a stable kingdom. It was that the spiritual and institutional center of Jewish life was annihilated. Rome did not just win a war. It burned the house around which Jewish public religion had been organized. Christianity, still emerging, would later interpret this event through its own theology. Rabbinic Judaism would interpret it through mourning, resilience, and reconstitution. But in the event itself, there is no resolution, only fire. The city that had held temple and empire at once now held ruins. 13. After the temple, the people who refused to vanish. Most ancient peoples whose identity was tied to land, king, and cult site would have dissolved after such defeats. The Jews did not. This is one of the central facts of world history. After 70 CE, Judaism begins a transformation that had earlier precedents but now becomes irreversible. Rabbinic leadership rises, study deepens, law, interpretation, and communal practice begin to replace sacrifice as the organizing center of Jewish life. The synagogue becomes more important. Text becomes a homeland portable enough to survive empire. Yavne becomes a symbol of this transition. Galilee becomes a center of Jewish continuity. Babylon, already home to Jews since exile, becomes a vast intellectual arena from which later rabbinic tradition will draw immense strength. The Talmudic world begins to take shape. The Jews of the region are no longer what they had been, but neither are they erased. They become something stranger and more durable, a civilization that can persist without sovereignty, without temple, without control of its holiest city. The people who refused to vanish did not do so by denying the loss. They encoded it. 14. 135 CE and the deepening of exile. The Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 CE was the last great attempt in antiquity to restore Jewish political independence by force against Rome. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that sovereignty might be reclaimed. Then Rome crushed the revolt with overwhelming brutality. The consequences were enormous. Judea was devastated. Jews were banned from Jerusalem. The city was refounded as Aelia Capitolina. The region was renamed Syria Palestina, widely understood as part of an imperial effort to weaken or erase explicit Jewish association with the land. If 70 CE destroyed the temple, 135 CE deepened exile into structure. Jewish life in the land did not cease. Populations remained, especially in Galilee. But Jerusalem, as a lived Jewish center, became more distant. Diaspora, which had already begun centuries earlier with Babylon and expanded under Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman conditions, now became far more definitive in its center of gravity. Exile was no longer temporary in any obvious sense. It became historical atmosphere. 15. Christian Jerusalem. As Rome Christianized and the eastern half of the empire evolved into what we call Byzantium, Jerusalem changed again. The city became Christian in architecture, pilgrimage, and imperial attention. Churches rose, especially the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The city was refitted around the memory of Jesus. For Christians, the temple had lost its central liturgical necessity. Jesus, resurrection, cross, and tomb displaced sacrifice and priesthood. But this did not make Jerusalem unimportant. It made the city important in a different way. Christian sacred geography was not centered on the Temple Mount, but on the places associated with Christ's passion and resurrection. Meanwhile, Jews continued to mourn the temple and pray toward Jerusalem, but their institutional life was no longer organized around access to the site. The city under Byzantium was thus Christian in public meaning, Jewish in remembered holiness, and Roman in imperial administration. This phase matters because it prepared the ground for later misunderstandings. Christianity did not forget Jerusalem. It reinterpreted it. The temple was eclipsed in theology, but the land was not emptied of significance. Sacred geography persisted under altered terms. 16. Arabia hears the prophets. Islam arises not in Jerusalem, but in Arabia, in the cities of Mecca and Medina, in the 7th century CEE. Muhammad was not raised Jewish. He did not emerge from a Jewish household or a rabbinic academy. But he preached in a late antique world already saturated with monotheistic ideas, biblical figures, and the prestige of older revelation. Jewish tribes were present in Arabia, especially in and around Medina. Christian communities and influences surrounded Arabia from north and south. The Quran speaks insistently of Abraham, Moses, David, Solomon, Mary, and Jesus. This is not accidental. Islam enters history by engaging the prophetic archive that Judaism and Christianity had already made central to the region. From a secular historical perspective, this engagement served a clear purpose. A new monotheistic movement seeking legitimacy in late antiquity would not present itself as a whimsical novelty. It would root itself in recognized sacred history. Islam does this powerfully. It does not merely borrow from earlier traditions, it recenters them. Abraham becomes Ibrahim, Ishmael becomes Ismail. The line of prophetic continuity is reclaimed and reinterpreted. The Abrahamic claim, especially the linkage of Arabs through Ishmael, is not historically verifiable as modern genealogy. It is best understood as a religious and civilizational narrative. But narratives matter. Islam was not only founding a faith, it was establishing a history in which Arabia itself was not peripheral but chosen. 17. When Islam enters Jerusalem. By the time Muslim armies reached Jerusalem, the Byzantine and Sasanian empires had exhausted each other in prolonged warfare. The Levant was vulnerable. Arabia, newly unified under Islam, had become something it had not previously been: a coherent political religious force capable of expansion. In 637 CE, under the Rashidun Caliphate, and during the rule of Umar ibn al-Khattab, Jerusalem passed from Byzantine to Muslim control. The conquest occurred within a broader military campaign, and therefore within violence, but the city itself did not fall by a massacre on the scale of 70 CE or 1099. It surrendered, control transferred. From the perspective of Jerusalem's existing population, Muslim rule was foreign politically and linguistically, but not wholly alien conceptually. Islam was another monotheism. It knew the prophets. It spoke of Abraham, Moses, David, and Jesus. In that sense, Muslim rule entered a city already layered with monotheistic memory and inserted itself as the final claimant in an existing sacred argument. The conquest of Jerusalem shortly after Muhammad's death was not proof that the city had been the political origin of Islam. It was evidence that a new empire had entered a weakened frontier and moved to possess one of the most symbolically charged cities in the known world. 18. The Mosque on the Mount. Around the late 7th and early 8th centuries, under the Umayyads, Islam materialized its claim upon Jerusalem in stone. The Dome of the Rock rose around 691 CE al-Aqsa in monumental form, followed around 705 CE. These structures were not built on random ground. They were built on or adjacent to the Temple Mount, the most symbolically dense site in the city. Why there? Because the site had not lost significance. It had lost active temple use for Jews and central theological necessity for Christians, but not symbolic weight. It was unmatched ground. To build there was to make an argument that Islam stood not outside the Abrahamic story, but at its culmination. This was not merely devotion. It was imperial theology expressed architecturally. The Umayyads needed to consolidate rule, stage legitimacy, and anchor Islam in sacred geography beyond Arabia. Jerusalem offered exactly that possibility. By raising monumental Islamic structures on the Old Mount, they were not only praying, they were narrating history. For Jews, the temple remained holy in memory and prayer, though no active rebuilding movement existed. For Christians, the temple itself was not central, but the city remained sacred. For Muslims, building there converted inherited symbolism into Islamic civilizational presence. The stones changed speakers, but the argument continued. 19. A city under Muslim rule. After the initial conquest, Jerusalem entered the long Muslim phase of its political history. Umayyads, Abbasids, Fatimids, Ayyubids, Mamluks, and Ottomans would govern it across centuries, with crusader interruptions, diplomatic anomalies, and administrative variation. Across the long arc, Muslim political control lasted roughly 1,177 years, between 637 and 1917, if one subtracts the main Crusader interruptions. This long Muslim rule did not make the city religiously singular. Jews remained. Christians remained. Different communities lived under layered hierarchy and changing regimes. Islamic rule often imposed subordination on non-Muslims through legal distinctions and taxation, but it also preserved a multi-religious urban reality. Jerusalem under Muslim rule was not an empty Islamic stage. It was an Islamic political city containing older communities and older sanctities. Over centuries, much of the wider region became majority Muslim, though never uniformly so. The city's rhythms changed. Arabic became dominant. Islamic institutions deepened. Yet the city was never spiritually monopolized. It could not be. Too many revelations had already claimed it. This long arc matters because it established Muslim rule, not as a brief episode, but as the historical baseline for more than a millennium before the British rupture. It also means that later, Western and nationalist interventions would not enter a vacuum. They would enter a deeply sedimented order. 20. When Christianity militarizes memory. Christianity had never ceased to care about Jerusalem. What changed in the age of the Crusades was not memory itself, but its militarization. For centuries, Christians had revered the city as the site of Jesus' death and resurrection. Pilgrimage bound the faithful to Jerusalem symbolically and physically. Under Byzantine rule, the city had been intensely Christianized. Under Muslim rule, Christians often continued to visit, worship, and live there, though under conditions not of their own sovereignty. Then, the political, military, and theological conditions shifted. The Seljuk advance destabilized the region. Byzantium weakened and appealed westward. The Latin Church grew more militant and more capable of coordinating trans-regional violence. The old sacred attachment to Jerusalem became fused with armed piety. Thus Christianity, which no longer depended on the temple and did not require possession of Jerusalem for salvation in the Jewish sense, nonetheless transformed the city into a military objective. Symbolic inheritance became territorial ambition. This was not a return to temple theology. It was the activation of Christian sacred geography under conditions of war. 21. The Crusaders and the Theology of Blood. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade. In 1099, Crusader forces captured Jerusalem. The conquest was marked by massacre. Muslims and Jews were killed in large numbers. Blood and sanctity mingled in one of the most grotesque displays of religious violence in medieval history. The Crusaders established the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. For roughly 88 years, from 1099 to 1187, Christians ruled the city directly, with a later brief restoration through treaty from 1229 to 1244. In total, Christian control over Jerusalem amounted to roughly a century. The Crusader seizure is important not because it endured, but because it revealed a permanent possibility, that Christian sacred memory could be weaponized into conquest. It also created a contrast that later Muslim memory would never forget. The Muslim conquest of 637 had involved negotiated surrender and administrative transition. The Crusader conquest of 1099 made slaughter itself into liturgy. Here, Christian reverence for Jerusalem found its most violent political expression. The city was not simply taken, it was baptized in triumphal cruelty. 22. Saladin and the return of Muslim rule. In 1187, Saladin defeated the Crusaders at Hattin and retook Jerusalem. His reconquest, though unquestionably military, did not replicate the massacres of 1099 on the same scale. The city returned to Muslim control, And though later crusaders would briefly regain it through diplomacy, the deeper arc had reasserted itself. Saladin's recovery of Jerusalem became a central chapter in Islamic memory because it reversed not merely territorial loss, but humiliation. The city that had been seized through Christian bloodlust was taken back and reinserted into Muslim rule. After 1244, Muslim control would remain uninterrupted until the 20th century. The Crusader century became, in the long view, an interruption rather than a new permanent order. Dramatic, traumatic, theologically charged, but structurally temporary. 23. The Ottoman centuries. When the Ottomans incorporated Jerusalem in 1517, they inherited not a frontier of novelty, but a city already shaped by long Islamic rule, layered sanctity, and imperial management. Ottoman governance lasted until 1917. It was one phase in the Muslim long arc, but because of its duration and late position in history, it would become especially important for modern memory. Under the Ottomans, Jerusalem was administered as part of a broader imperial order that governed through hierarchy, local communities, and relative continuity, more than through homogenizing nationalism. The city remained multi-religious. Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived within a framework that was unequal but legible. The empire did not solve the problem of Jerusalem. It domesticated it. Ottoman rule did not carry the drama of temple destruction or crusader massacre, which is precisely why it can be overlooked. But continuity itself is a form of historical power. For centuries, the city remained under Muslim imperial governance, without modern nation-state categories, yet dictating every question of legitimacy. Sacred communities existed, often uneasily, inside an imperial rather than nationalist arrangement. This continuity would make the rupture that followed all the more destabilizing. 24. The British rupture. In 1917, British forces under General Edmund Allenby captured Jerusalem from the Ottomans during the First World War. British rule over Jerusalem and Palestine was brief, roughly from 1917 to 1948, with formal League of Nations mandate authority beginning in 1920. In duration, it was tiny, around 30 years. In consequence, it was enormous. The British conquest itself was not a crusade. It was strategic war against the Ottomans, part of the broader imperial struggle of World War I. Yet religious imagery and biblical imagination hovered over British discourse. Allenby entered Jerusalem on foot, symbolically. Protestant restorationist currents in British political culture had already prepared elites to see the land through scriptural eyes. Still, what makes the British rupture decisive is not pious sentiment alone. It is that Western imperial governance entered a region that had for centuries operated under Islamic imperial political logic, and began reorganizing it under modern categories: mandates, borders, national promises, legal administration, external planning. The old empire had fallen. A new and much less rooted system stepped in. The transition from Muslim to Western control was therefore extremely recent in historical terms, and very brief. But brevity does not reduce rupture. Sometimes it intensifies it. 25. The fatal modern insertion. What Britain inserted into the region was not merely another ruling dynasty. It was a new political grammar. Empire was giving way to nation-state thinking, and the transition came compressed, externalized, and full of contradiction. The British issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917, supporting a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. At the same time, Arab expectations and promises had also been cultivated in the broader anti-Ottoman war effort. The same empire was managing incompatible futures. Meanwhile, Zionism, a modern nationalist movement, gathered force. It was not simply a repetition of ancient Jewish longing, nor merely a modern invention detached from older memory. It was a 19th and 20th century political movement shaped by European nationalism, modern anti-Semitism, secular statecraft, and the claim that Jews should become once more a sovereign people in their ancestral land. But it also drew real force from an older Jewish liturgical, textual, and historical attachment to that land, preserved across centuries of exile, prayer, and ritual memory. Arab resistance also intensified, now articulated increasingly through modern political forms. This is why the region destabilized, not because Western governance touched a Muslim-majority region, and therefore chaos was inevitable, but because an old imperial structure collapsed and was replaced by modern borders, modern nationalisms, conflicting promises, colonial administration, and imported state concepts all at once. Britain did not create every later conflict by itself. Arab resistance, Jewish militancy, incompatible national projects, and the violence surrounding partition would all intensify the fracture. But British rule created the unstable frame in which those collisions hardened into a new and enduring order of conflict. The fatal insertion was not simply Britain. It was modernity in imperial uniform. 26. The competing myths of return. By the time modern politics fully seized Jerusalem and the wider land, every major claimant possessed a usable past. Jews could point to the ancient kingdoms, the First and Second Temples, the Hasmoneans, the continuity of memory, liturgy, and longing. Muslims could point to more than a millennium of political control, to the deep Islamization of the region, to the sanctification of Jerusalem in Islamic history, and to uninterrupted presence. Christians could point to the city of Jesus, Byzantine Jerusalem, pilgrimage, and the long Christian sacralization of the land. Each tradition could tell the truth selectively. Each could compress the past into a weapon. The Jewish sovereignty claim, if based purely on duration, is historically weaker than maximal nationalist myth often suggests, because Jewish sovereign control over Jerusalem and the land, while real, politically consequential, and civilizationally formative, was not the dominant condition of the long timeline. Roughly 500 years of direct Jewish sovereignty, counting the monarchic and Hasmonean phases, stand against longer stretches of imperial and Muslim rule. But to say this is not to say Jewish connection is false or trivial. It is to say that historical duration alone cannot bear the full moral and political weight later placed upon it. Likewise, long Muslim rule does not mechanically grant eternal legitimacy. It establishes continuity, majority formation, and deep-rootedness, but duration alone cannot settle modern sovereignty either. Christian claims are powerful symbolically and thin politically. Every side inherits part of the city. None inherit all of it uncontested. Thus, Jerusalem becomes not merely a place of competing rights, but of competing compressions of time. 27. What the stones actually say. The stones say first that no one entered a blank stage. They say there was Canaan before Israel, and Israel before empire, and empire before return, and return before ruin, and ruin before mosque, and mosque before crusade, and crusade before Ottoman continuity, and Ottoman continuity before British rupture. They say every ruler claimed continuity while rewriting the meaning of the ground beneath their feet. They say Jerusalem is not best understood as the eternal possession of one people, but as a city repeatedly seized by those who believed history had culminated in them. David centralized it. Babylonians burned it. Persians permitted its rebuilding. Greeks pressured it. Maccabees fought for it. Romans monumentalized and destroyed it. Christians sanctified it around Christ. Muslims absorbed it into Abrahamic finality. Crusaders slaughtered for it. Ottomans managed it. Britain destabilized it. Modern ideologies nationalized it. The stones say also that memory outlives sovereignty. Jews lost the city and kept it in prayer. Christians ruled it and lost it, but kept it in liturgy. Muslims held it for centuries and built into it their own claim to final revelation. Jerusalem is where theology learns administration, where memory learns masonry, where loss learns architecture. Most of all, the stones say that sacredness does not produce innocence. It produces stakes. 28. Epilogue. A land too holy for innocence. Jerusalem did not become tragic because men loved it too little. It became tragic because every empire, every creed, every conqueror arrived convinced that history had prepared the city for them. That is the secret violence of sacred land. Once a place becomes the meeting point of revelation and rule, no one merely governs it. Everyone interprets it. The Jews made Jerusalem the center of covenantal sovereignty and then learned how to survive when sovereignty and temple were taken away. Christianity inherited the city through Jesus and then, at certain moments, converted symbolic devotion into armed possession. Islam arrived later in historical time, but claimed earlier in sacred continuity, taking the city into its own Abrahamic horizon and inscribing that claim in stone. Then came the long Muslim centuries, and then, suddenly in historical terms, the West. Britain did not hold the land long. That is precisely why its impact was so destructive. A brief imperial administration, armed with modern categories and biblical imagination, intervened in a region whose social and spiritual structure had been formed over more than a millennium under another political order. It promised, it partitioned, it administered, it departed. The vacuum remained full of history and empty of settlement. This is why the city resists innocence. No one approaches it without narrative. No one leaves it without blood or prayer. The struggle over Jerusalem has never been only about land. It has always been about who gets to say what the land means. The Babylonians said it meant submission. The Persians said restoration under empire. Rome said order. Christianity said fulfillment. Islam said completion. Modern nationalism says return, liberation, sovereignty, peoplehood. Every age gives the city a final explanation. None has succeeded in making it final. And so the stones remember what men forget, that the city existed before their claim and will outlast their certainty. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.